Here they may once again be unknowingly committing the fallacy of false dilemma, as there are numerous aid organizations sponsored by the United Nations or other non-profit organizations that can provide support and aid to victims of natural disasters, so they do not have to fall into sex trafficking.
Many religions and philosophies around the world state that women are not worth as much as men. This leads to the perception that the gains of selling a girl to a sex trafficker or labor agency outweigh the cost because they're unimportant and an economic liability until married. Women are seen as an economic liability for the family because, due to mores in many cultures, women are limited in where they can work. In some cultures, because early marriage is so common, families can see sex trade in the same light and justify selling off their daughters to sex traffickers that way. Both marriage and sale to the commercial sex industry bring an economic gain to the family. For example, in Thailand, one of the dominant religions is Theravada Buddhism and limits the role of women in Thai society, impacting the high amount of sex trafficking in that country, as this video explains.
All of these areas of knowing contribute to a perception of sex trafficking as acceptable, or at the very least, the only option women have in society. However, as we've shown, this perception is based on fallacious reasoning, on premises of a false dilemma. Because of the negative effects of sex trafficking as a whole, sex trafficking is unacceptable and detracts from society more than it aids the individual. While it may be a way for families and individuals to support themselves, all it truly does is perpetuate the cycle of violence and human bondage, while harming the individual mentally more than it helps them economically.
Psychology has shown us the negative effects of sex trafficking. Essentially, sex traffickers condition their victims into believing that they have no escape from the world of sex trafficking. This condition comes in three forms: beatings, addiction to drugs and alcohol, and subjection to debt bondage. Traffickers often beat, drug, and rape their victims to keep them under control, as well as to keep them from running away. One such example of this is the story of Katya from Ukraine.
Потом они привели мужика и сказали, типа, если я его не удовлетворю, то меня убьют. Когда зашел в комнату мужик, я начала с ним драться. Ворвались еще какие-то двое. Повязали меня. Потом обратно наркотики. Били, избивали. Насиловали.
Victims are often subject to Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological disorder where the victims express positive feelings towards the traffickers. This is another way to keep the victims in submission, as it makes them unwilling to trust law enforcement due to the potential harm it could cause the traffickers. The victims willingly remain part of sex trafficking, leading to a self-perpetuating sex trade, which is detrimental to society.
Drugs can also add to the debt bondage that victims are subjected to. Traffickers tell their victims that they owe the traffickers either for passage to another country or to support their room and board. The only way they can pay off their debt is through selling themselves into the sex trade. They are permanently kept in a state of submission because of this, and they reason that they cannot leave their traffickers until they have paid their debt, which can keep accruing due to the cost of room and board.
International legislature, religion, and the media have set up an ethical paradigm that has deemed sex trafficking unacceptable. International legislature, by taking action against sex traffickers, has shown that sex trafficking should not be tolerated. The United Nations adopted the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime in 2000. This protocol states that each member country shall adopt legislative measures to establish sex trafficking as a criminal activity and liable to prosecution and censure. Each country is required to establish protection and a certain amount of assistance and rehabilitation to victims as well. Most countries have followed United Nations regulations and adopted legislation that punishes sex traffickers, which lends to an international perception that sex trafficking is unacceptable. Whether or not that legislation is enforced is another matter entirely.
Many religions across the world have a doctrine that states no sex before marriage, and list adultery as one of the sins, which also adds to the perception that sex trafficking is unacceptable, as it violates one or both of these doctrines. This also adds to the self-perpetuation of the sex trade. Society does not make a distinction between the traffickers and the victims as far as the violation of these doctrines goes. Victims are unable to leave the trade because societies degrade them and do not allow them to find work or acceptance outside of the trade. This video is an example of one such situation.
When I was a little girl, I dreamed of going to school and then finding someone to love, to have a family. That was my dream when I was a little girl. Then I was forced to become a prostitute at age 13.
My
mother died when I was very young. My stepmother was mean. She would beat me and refuse to give me food. So I left my father's house to find work. When I arrived in the big city, a woman said she can give me a job at her house. I was very happy to have some work and a place to stay. But at this woman's house, men would come. If I tried to refuse, the woman would beat me or shock me with electricity. And there was always someone watching, so I could not escape. In this house, I was one of 15 girls. After 2 years, I convinced the woman to let me go so I can find my father and stepmother. When I found them, they despised me and told me to leave. For 3 days and nights, I slept in the fields along the road without any food. Hungry and alone, I sat near a garden and waited for men to come to me. After several customers, I had enough money to get some food and a bus ticket. In the city, a man found me and said he had a safe place for me to stay. Then he sold me to another brothel. When I was a prostitute, I was required to have 15 men each day. If I did not, I would be beaten and refused food. This is the story of my life. I am now 24, and I am dying from AIDS. One of my greatest fears is that when I die, no one will come to my burial.
The media also portrays sex trafficking as unacceptable, as the countless documentaries, videos, and news articles show. Recently, the media has gone beyond simple news articles to bringing the issue right to the people, as a story in Israel shows. In an attempt to break the taboo in the Middle East on the discussion of sex trafficking, a media group has created a storefront in a busy district in Tel Aviv. The window displays women for sale, with tags around their wrist describing their age, weight, height, dimensions, and country of origin, and is a ploy to bring attention to the high amount of sex trafficking in the Middle East.
Sex tourism is the act of traveling to another country in order to take advantage of the looser regulations on sex trafficking in that country in order to have sex with minors. Sex tourism also indicates a lack of global acceptance of sex trafficking. Sex tourism is concentrated only in a few countries such as Thailand, Syria, and Cyprus, and tourists come from all over the world to these tourism destinations. This points to acceptance in a few individual societies. However, globally, because sex tourism is concentrated in a few countries, and tourists feel the need to leave their own country to take part in sex trafficking, it is unacceptable.
The following video displays sex tourism. point, we must draw your attention to a problem of knowledge in looking at the acceptability of sex trafficking in society. So many countries prefer to pretend that the problem does not exist because it is either not cohesive with their view of a free society, a problem more commonly found in Europe or the United States, or they refuse to discuss it because there is a religious or social taboo against such a discussion. As this video shows, there is a lack of clear data in terms of statistics or knowledge on victims of sex trafficking.
Okay, when you hear the word sex trafficking, what do you think?
I know it happens.
Isn't it like abusing women and just taking like runaway girls and kids and so on? Yeah.
What is like minors when they get like hooked on heroin, you know, brought from other countries?
I think of Indonesia. What about sex trafficking in Phoenix?
Didn't know it was even possible.
There is also a lack of information on male victims who, while they are not in the majority, still make up a portion of sex trafficking victims. However, this problem supports our knowledge claim that sex trafficking is unacceptable because if it was acceptable in society, would there be a lack of information or a taboo against it?
We think not.
Sex trafficking is unacceptable due to the ethical paradigms set down by the United Nations, various world religions, and the media. It does not help the individual due to the psychological harm and economic bondage the victims are subjected to. Though the individuals believe that they have good reasoning to take part or sell families into the sex trade, they commit the fallacy of false dilemma in their reasoning, making any argument that the sex trade is acceptable invalid. Finally, by not acknowledging the problem, society itself has deemed it unacceptable. It is a detriment to society as a whole because it violates the ethical paradigms set down by international legislature, media, and religion, and because it is self-perpetuating. It harms the individual through the psychological damage and economic pressure it puts the individual under.
We believe that, though sex trafficking is recognized as unacceptable globally, the lack of enforcement of international legislature and the lack of knowledge about the issue in general is the reason for its perpetuation. To end the sex trade, the population overall, and women especially, need to be better educated on the physical and mental trauma they go through as victims, as well as the lures sex traffickers use to attract their targets. The population also needs to be better educated so that they can support themselves and not fall into the fallacy of false dilemma reasoning, believing that the sex trade is their only option for survival.